Hello everyone, my name is Peter. Today, I want to tell you a story about my English learning journey. It is not a story about a special teacher. It is not a story about an expensive English course. And it is not a story about a secret method that can make you speak English fluently in a few days. It is much simpler than that. My English became better because I started reading more. At first, I did not think reading could change my English very much. I thought reading was only useful for learning new words. I was wrong. After reading English every day for a long time, I slowly noticed something. My vocabulary became larger. My grammar became more natural. My sentences became easier to build. My pronunciation improved. And most importantly, I started to understand English without translating every sentence into my native language. That was a big change for me. Let me tell you how it happened. When I was younger, I wanted to learn English. I knew English was important. I knew it could help me communicate with people from different countries. It could also help me study, work, travel, and discover new information. But knowing that English was important was not enough. I still had a problem. I did not know how to learn it effectively. I tried many things. I memorized vocabulary lists. I studied grammar rules. I watched English videos. I listened to English songs. Sometimes I even tried to speak English with myself, but I often felt frustrated. I could remember a word today. Then I forgot it a few days later. I could understand a grammar rule. But when I wanted to speak, I did not know how to use it. I could understand a short sentence. But a longer paragraph sometimes looked like a wall of difficult words. I wanted to improve quickly. That was probably my biggest mistake. I wanted fast results. I wanted to speak English perfectly. I wanted to understand everything. I wanted to remember hundreds of new words. But language learning does not work like that. English needs time, it needs repetition, and it needs regular contact with the language. One day, I decided to change my learning habit. Instead of studying English only when I had a test, I started reading something in English every day. At first, I chose very simple materials. I read short stories. I read short news articles. I read simple conversations. I also read articles about topics that I already liked. This was important. Because if I chose something too difficult, I would quickly become tired. So I stopped trying to impress myself with difficult books. I stopped thinking that a good English learner had to read difficult English. Instead, I asked myself a simple question. Can I understand most of this? If the answer was yes, I continued reading. If the answer was no, I found something easier. In the beginning, I had to look up many words. Sometimes one paragraph contained 5 or 10 words that I did not know. It was annoying. I wanted to understand everything immediately. So I opened my dictionary again and again. But after a few weeks, something interesting happened. I needed the dictionary less often. I began to understand new words from context. For example, I might see a sentence with a word I had never learned before. Instead of stopping immediately, I looked at the words around it. I looked at the situation. I looked at the meaning of the whole paragraph. Then I made a guess. Sometimes my guess was correct, sometimes it was wrong. But even when I was wrong, I was learning. This taught me an important lesson. You do not need to understand every single word to understand a text. This sounds simple. But it changed the way I read English. Before that, I thought every unknown word was a problem. Later, I realized that some unknown words were not important. If I could understand the main idea, I could continue reading. This made reading much more enjoyable. And because reading became enjoyable, I started doing it more often. That was the beginning of real progress. I remember one evening when I was reading a short English story. I suddenly noticed that I was not translating every sentence anymore. I was simply reading. The words came into my mind as English. I did not stop to think about the meaning of every word in my native language. It was a small moment, but for me, it felt amazing. I realized that my brain was slowly getting used to English. That was when I understood something important. Reading is not only about learning vocabulary. Reading teaches your brain how English works. When you read a lot, you see the same words many times. You see the same grammar patterns again and again. You see how native speakers connect ideas. You see how questions are formed. You see how people express feelings. You see how stories are organized. And you begin to recognize these patterns naturally. For example, before I started reading regularly, I often had trouble with prepositions. I was never sure whether I should use one preposition or another. I could memorize the rules, but I still made mistakes. After reading thousands of English sentences, however, something changed. I began to remember expressions as complete phrases. I did not always remember the grammar rule. I simply remembered how the sentence looked and sounded. This made my English more natural. I learned that sometimes the best way to learn grammar is not to memorize hundreds of rules. Sometimes it is better to see the same structure many times in real sentences. Reading gave me that opportunity. Another big benefit was vocabulary. Before I started reading regularly, I tried to memorize long lists of words. For example, I might learn 20 new words in one day. I felt proud. But after a week, I could remember only a few of them. Then I changed my strategy. I stopped trying to learn too many words at once. Instead, I focused on words that appeared naturally in things I was reading. If I saw an interesting word several times, I paid attention to it. If I saw the same expression in different articles, I remembered it. This was much more effective. Why? Because I was learning words in context. I was not just learning that a word had a particular meaning. I was learning how people actually used it. For example, learning the word decision is useful. But seeing expressions such as make a decision, a difficult decision, or the right decision is even more useful. Now I know how the word behaves in a sentence. That is the kind of knowledge that helps you speak naturally. Reading also helped me with writing. Before reading a lot, writing English was difficult for me. I often knew what I wanted to say, but I did not know how to organize my ideas. My sentences sometimes sounded strange. Then I started reading more carefully. I noticed how good writers began their paragraphs. I noticed how they introduced an idea. I noticed how they gave examples. I noticed how they moved from one idea to another. Without realizing it, I started copying these patterns. I did not copy the exact sentences, I copied the structure. I learned how to connect ideas. I learned how to make my writing smoother. I learned that short sentences can sometimes be more powerful than long and complicated ones. This is another reason why reading is so useful. When you read, you are learning from examples. You are seeing English in action. You are not only studying rules in isolation. You are seeing how those rules are used by real writers. Reading also improved my speaking. At first, this may sound strange. You might ask, Peter, reading is a quiet activity. How can it improve speaking? I had the same question. But after a while, I noticed that reading gave me more language to use. When I read conversations, I learned useful expressions. When I read stories, I learned ways to describe people and situations. When I read opinions, I learned how to express agreement and disagreement. When I read everyday conversations, I learned simple phrases that people actually use. So when I had to speak, I had more language available in my mind. Reading gave me building blocks. Speaking became easier because I had more building blocks to work with. Of course, reading alone was not enough. I also needed to listen. I needed to speak. I needed to practice pronunciation. But reading made all those activities easier. For example, when I listened to a podcast, I sometimes recognized expressions that I had already seen while reading. That made listening easier. When someone used a phrase I had read many times, I could understand it quickly. The more I read, the more familiar English became. It started to feel less like a foreign subject. It started to feel like a normal part of my daily life. This was probably the biggest change. English stopped being something I studied. It became something I used. I began reading English in the morning. Sometimes I read for only 10 minutes. Sometimes I read for 30 minutes. On weekends, I might read for an hour or more. But I did not force myself to read for many hours every day. I focused on consistency. 10 minutes every day was better than 2 hours once a month. This is something I strongly believe. Small habits can create big results. You do not need to change your entire life to improve your English. You just need to create a small habit and keep doing it. For me, reading became that habit. I also learned how to choose the right level. This is very important. If you are a beginner, do not immediately choose a difficult English novel. You may understand only 10% of it. You will probably spend more time using a dictionary than enjoying the story. That can make you feel tired. Instead, choose something that is slightly easier. You should understand enough to follow the main idea. At the same time, there should be some new words and expressions. That balance is useful. You want English to be challenging, but you do not want it to be impossible. I also learned that the topic matters. If you love sports, read about sports. If you love technology, read technology articles. If you enjoy travel, read travel stories. If you like cooking, read recipes and food blogs. If you enjoy stories, read stories. The goal is to make English interesting. When you are interested in the topic, you forget that you are studying. You are simply learning something you enjoy. And that makes it much easier to continue. There were also days when I did not want to read. I think that is normal. No learner is motivated every day. Sometimes I was tired. Sometimes I was busy. Sometimes I simply wanted to relax. On those days, I gave myself permission to read something very easy. Maybe I read a short article. Maybe I read a few pages of a simple book. Sometimes I read only one paragraph. The important thing was to keep the habit alive. I did not need a perfect day. I just needed another small step. Over time, those small steps became hundreds of hours of English exposure. And hundreds of hours made a difference. Another thing I discovered was that rereading can be extremely useful. At first, I thought reading the same text twice was a waste of time. Why read something I had already read? But later, I understood the value. The first time I read something, I focused on the meaning. The second time, I noticed vocabulary. The third time, I noticed grammar. Sometimes I read a sentence aloud. This helped me connect reading with speaking and pronunciation. Rereading also made me feel more confident. The text became easier. I could understand more. I could recognize words faster. That feeling of progress motivated me to continue. I also started keeping a small vocabulary notebook. But I did not write down every new word. That would have been too much. Instead, I wrote down useful words and phrases. I wrote the complete phrase. Sometimes I wrote my own example sentence. This helped me remember the word better. For example, instead of writing only the word improve, I might write, I want to improve my English. Then I could see how the word was actually used. This simple habit helped me build a collection of useful expressions. After several months, my notebook became quite large. But the most important thing was not the notebook. The most important thing was the reading that created those notes. Reading gave the words a context. Context gave the words meaning. And repeated exposure helped the words stay in my memory. I also learned not to be afraid of forgetting. This was difficult for me. Sometimes I learned a new word and forgot it the next week. I used to think that meant I had failed. Now I understand that forgetting is a normal part of learning. You may forget a word today, then see it again next month. You may forget it again. Then see it 5 more times. Eventually, the word becomes familiar. One day you use it without thinking. That is how vocabulary grows. It is not always a straight line. Sometimes you remember, sometimes you forget. Sometimes you make progress quickly. Sometimes you feel like nothing is changing. But if you continue, the progress is there. Reading taught me patience. It taught me that language learning is a long journey. There is no need to rush. There is no need to compare yourself with other people. Someone else may learn faster. Someone else may speak better. Someone else may know thousands of words. That is okay. Your job is simply to become better than you were yesterday. For me, reading was one of the easiest ways to measure that progress. A few months ago, I might have needed 10 minutes to understand a page. Later, I could understand it in 5 minutes. A book that once looked difficult became comfortable. An article that once contained too many unknown words became easier. A sentence that once confused me became obvious. These small improvements showed me that I was moving forward. Today, I still make mistakes in English. I still meet words I do not know. I still sometimes misunderstand a sentence. I still need to learn new grammar and vocabulary. But I no longer feel afraid of those things. I know what to do. I simply keep reading. I believe reading is one of the most powerful tools for English learners because it gives you something very important: exposure. You need to see English. You need to see it again and again and again. The more you see natural English, the more familiar it becomes. Eventually, some expressions become automatic. You do not need to translate them. You simply understand them. That is what happened to me. Reading changed the way I think about English. Before, I thought English was a collection of rules. Now I see it as a living language. It is a way people communicate. It is a way people tell stories. It is a way people share ideas. And reading lets me experience that language every day. So if you are learning English right now, I have one simple suggestion: start reading. Do not wait until your English is perfect. You do not need perfect English before you start reading. Reading is one of the things that can help you make your English better. Start with something easy. Choose a topic you like. Read a little every day. Do not worry about understanding every word. Try to understand the main idea first. Look up important words when necessary. Pay attention to useful phrases. Notice how sentences are built. Read some sentences aloud. And most importantly, enjoy the process. Do not turn every reading session into a test. You are not trying to prove how much English you know. You are trying to become more familiar with English. There is a big difference. Sometimes you will understand everything. Sometimes you will understand only half. Sometimes you will read a page and feel completely lost. That is okay. Choose an easier text. Try again. Keep moving. Your English does not need to improve dramatically every day. It just needs to improve little by little. Imagine reading 5 pages every day. That may not sound like much. But 5 pages a day becomes more than 1,800 pages in a year. Imagine learning just a few useful expressions from those pages. Imagine seeing thousands of natural English sentences. Imagine hearing those expressions later in conversations. Imagine using them yourself. That is how reading can quietly change your English. It may not feel exciting at first. There may be no dramatic moment. There may be no sudden transformation, but something is happening. Your brain is collecting patterns. Your vocabulary is growing. Your grammar is becoming more familiar. Your confidence is increasing. And little by little, English becomes easier. Looking back at my own journey, I am glad that I discovered the power of reading. It gave me vocabulary, it gave me grammar, it gave me ideas. It helped my writing, it helped my speaking, it helped my listening. But more than anything, it gave me confidence. I stopped being afraid of English. I stopped thinking that every sentence had to be translated. I stopped worrying about every small mistake. I became more comfortable with not understanding everything. And that comfort made learning easier. Now, when I have free time, I often choose to read something in English. Sometimes it is a book, sometimes it is an article. Sometimes it is a short story. Sometimes it is just a few pages on a topic that interests me. The material does not matter as much as the habit. I keep exposing myself to English. That is the secret that worked for me, not a complicated method, not an expensive course. Not studying 12 hours a day, just consistent practice, one page, one paragraph, one sentence, one new expression, one day at a time. So if you want to improve your English, give reading a chance. Start small, read something you enjoy, read every day, be patient with yourself. And remember that progress can be quiet. You may not notice it today. You may not notice it tomorrow. But after several months, you may look back and realize something. The English that once seemed difficult is now easier. The words that once looked strange are now familiar. The sentences that once confused you now make sense. And perhaps, like me, you will realize that reading did more than teach you English. It changed your relationship with English. For me, reading was not just a study method, it became a daily habit. It became a source of knowledge, it became a way to relax. And it became one of the most important parts of my English learning journey. My name is Peter. And if there is one lesson I have learned from my journey, it is this. You do not have to learn English perfectly. You just have to keep meeting English every day, read a little, listen a little, speak a little, write a little, then do it again tomorrow. Over time, those small actions become something much bigger. That is how I improved my English. I read more, I learned more, I understood more. And slowly I became more confident, so open a book, choose an article, find a story, read the first sentence, then read the next one. Do not worry about how far you have to go, just begin. Because sometimes, a better English future can start with something as simple as reading one more page today. Thank you for listening. I hope my story can give you a little motivation. And I hope that one day you will also discover the simple power of reading. Keep reading, keep learning, and keep improving. See you next time.